Well, I hope that you're doing good today. I hope that you've had a good week so far. And as always, I hope that you are excited to study the Word of God for the next few minutes. It's so refreshing to fill our minds with something that is so very pure. I know some people are sick, and we definitely want to remember those people in our prayers. I know a lot of people are catching the flu, so we need to be careful. If you are sick or you're hurting in any way and we don't know about it, like we always say, please let us know. If we can do anything at all for you, we just ask that you would ask us. We don't have any announcements, so we can jump right into what we're going to talk about tonight. We need to talk about Genesis chapter 1, starting in verse 6. You might remember last week we went through a little bit of the text and we talked about day-age theory and gap theory a little bit. And tonight we can continue in Genesis chapter 1. This is what Genesis chapter 1 and verse 6 says. And God said, let there be an expanse in the midst of the waters, and let it separate the waters from the waters. And God made the expanse and separated the waters that were under the expanse from the waters that were above the expanse. And it was so. And God called the expanse, you might have, if you're reading the ESV, it says heaven, or I think the NIV says sky. And there was evening and there was morning the second day. Well, what does God do on the second day? Well, He takes the waters and He divides the waters with what is called, according to Genesis, the expanse. So now we have the creation of two different spheres, one sphere lying above the expanse, one sphere lying below the expanse. And notice that there are waters in each sphere. So in one sphere, that is below the expanse, this is the water that would work to feed streams and rivers and things like that. The water, I think, that we're all very familiar with. But then, at least we're familiar with that part of the text. The waters above the expanse, well, that might be a little bit more foreign to us. We need to remember that the ancients thought about the earth perhaps in a different way than we did. In fact, you might remember our study of the book of Job in Job chapter 38. In Job chapter 38, looking at starting in verse 22, this is what is said. Have you entered the storehouses of the snow, or have you seen the storehouses of the hail, which I have reserved for the time of trouble, for the days of battle and war? What is the way to the place where the light is disturbed, or where the east wind is scattered upon the earth? Who has cleft a channel for the torrents of rain, and a way for the thunderbolt, to bring rain on a land where no man is, on the desert in which there is no man, to satisfy the waste and desolate land, and to make the ground sprout with grass? I'm sorry, I'm struggling a little bit with sinuses, and my nose is starting to itch and my eyes are starting to water, but we'll get through it. Notice what God says here in Job chapter 38. Have you entered the storehouses of the snow, or have you seen the storehouses of the hail? Well, by God's telling this to Job, we get an insight into the way that the ancients perhaps thought about the world, and that is to say that above the expanse, they thought that, this is where the snow gathered. This is where the rain was gathered, and God could just let the rain out, or He could let the snow out. The stars, we're going to talk about the stars later, but the stars sort of traveled along the outer edge of the expanse or this dome we probably should be thinking of. So the outside of this dome. Now, notice, let's go back to verses 6 through 8. So God creates the expanse separates the waters from the waters. And notice what is said at the end, and it was so, and God called the expanse heaven, and there was evening, and there was morning the second day. What's missing? What's missing there in the text? You might remember that usually each creative element starts out, or each creative section starts out with, and God said. And God will say whatever he wants to say that pertains to his creation. And then it will be. And then what happens after that? Well, it's customary in the book of Genesis for God to give an evaluation of his current creation. Well, what's missing here? Well, God doesn't give an evaluative judgment. Well, why not? Well, we have to think, because he doesn't, that the separating of the waters by means of the expanse was to fulfill some higher purpose that he will eventually pronounce a judgment on. Genesis chapters, I'm off today. Genesis chapter 1, 9 through 13. And God said, let the waters under the heavens be gathered together in one place, and let dry land appear. And it was so. God called the dry land earth, and the waters that were gathered together he called seas. And God saw that it was good. And God said, let the earth sprout vegetation, plants yielding seed, and fruit trees bearing fruit in which is their seed, each according to its kind on the earth. And it was so. The earth brought forth vegetation, plants yielding seed according to their own kinds, and trees bearing fruit in which is their seed, each according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. And there was evening and there was morning the third day. So on day 3 here in Genesis, God performs 2 creative acts. Notice the first creative act. God, the waters that are below the expanse, God calls the waters to come together so that dry land appears. Now, notice what God calls the dry land. He calls it what we know of today, earth, and he calls the waters seas. Now that's interesting. Remember what we talked about last week, that in the ancient Near East there were many different creation myths that were circulating around. And usually in these different creation myths, the God that is doing the creating faces some opposition from some hostile force. And that hostile force usually lives in the sea. The sea symbolizes darkness and chaos, usually where this sea monster lives. We talked about the Enuma Elish, and we talked about Tiamat being this monster, right? Well, notice that's lacking. Those kind of details in the book of Genesis are lacking in its creation account, right? God doesn't face opposition from some sea creature that he must defeat in order to create the world. No, God calls the seas. He named the sea. He named this body of water because he controls it. God is sovereign over everything. There's nothing that God must defeat in order to create. But then, notice, secondly, God gives the land power to produce not only a variety of different types of life, but also an abundance of life. Now, this obviously is needed. Why? Well, we're going to see that he's going to create animals. Those animals need to eat. They need to eat the plants. And humans, what are humans going to eat? Well, starting out in this portion of the book of Genesis at least, humans are also going to need to eat the plants. But notice that God gives the land at least some type of power to generate life. These seeds, notice, according to their kind. Fruit must have seeds in it that have the capability of germinating and producing the same type of life. So in a way, nature is remarkable. Is this a deification of nature in the book of Genesis? Well, I think we all know the answer to that. No, it's not. God limits nature, and because God has limited nature and He has bestowed power upon the land, nature is very predictable. So notice, this isn't to say that nature has some, I don't want to say nature is not God, right? No. God is still sovereign over nature. So God is sovereign over the sea. We've seen that already. God is sovereign over nature as well. But then notice verse 14, and God said, let there be lights in the expanse of the heavens to separate the day from the night, and let them be for signs and for seasons and for days and years, and let them be lights in the expanse of the heavens to give light upon the earth. And it was so. And God made the two great lights, the great light to rule the day, and the lesser night to rule the night, and the stars. And God set them in the expanse of the heavens to give light on the earth, to rule over the day and over the night, and to separate the light from the darkness. And God saw that it was good. And there was evening and there was morning, the fourth day. Well, here we have the creation of the heavenly luminaries, right? Now, remember what we said about at least how some ancients thought of the earth. You have this sphere, right? You have the expanse. We're thinking of the expanse. You have this sphere, and above this sphere is like the heavenly storehouses that God has already described in the book of Job. Well, on the outer edge of this sphere is the path that the heavenly luminaries took. Now, what was the purpose for God creating these two great lights? Well, one was to mark a distinction, to make a distinction, I guess I should say, not mark. To make a distinction between day and night, to separate day and night. But it was also to mark seasons and days and years. Now, we know from reading our Old Testaments that Israel had to observe several different holy festivals, and they weren't to observe these holy festivals whenever they saw fit. No, there was an appointed time for those festivals. Well, how in the world was Israel to keep up with the time? Well, time is marked by what? It's marked by these great lights. That's how we measure time, and that's how they would be able to track when they needed to keep these feasts. Why the use of the generic terms? Why the use of the greater light and the lesser night? Well, perhaps the Bible is trying to show us that it is familiar with I'm sorry, I lost my track of thought. Perhaps the Bible, I guess I should say, is trying to show us its familiarity with the fact that some people have given the status of God to the sun. You know, you think about the Egyptians and the worshiping of, the sun because of the sun god, Ra or Re, however you like to pronounce that. Well, notice again the generic terms. God is above these things, right? He is the sovereign creator. He is the Lord. And God said, let the waters swarm with swarms of living creatures, and let birds fly above the earth across the expanse of the heavens. Now, notice we said when God set the expanse, He created two spheres, a sphere above the expanse and a sphere below the expanse. Well, now we're starting to feel these spheres. The birds are going to fly in the air. The fish are going to swim in the sea. So God created the great sea creatures and every living creature that moves, with which the waters swarm according to their kinds, and every winged bird according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. This is where we're going to stop, because I do not want to split up the thought that we want to talk about in this verse. So we'll end a couple minutes early tonight. Be reading the book of Genesis. I hope that you will grow closer to God in our study in the book of Genesis. I can't wait to see everybody Sunday. God bless.